I'm Richard August, and I'll be your host for this edition of State of the State. This program is part 2 of our discussion of critical race theory and whether or not it is being introduced into the curriculum in Rhode Island public schools. In part 1, State Representative Patricia Morgan talked about her attempt to pass a bill that would prohibit the teaching of, quote, divisive concepts in public schools, and how her effort was met with disdain, especially among the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee. Our guest is Ramona Bessinger, a teacher in a middle school in Providence. Welcome to State of the State.
Thank you for having me.
Would you tell our audience, first of all, a bit about yourself, your background, and so forth?
Sure. Well, I've been teaching for 22 years, and I've been teaching primarily English at the high school level. I started out my teaching at a suburban school, took a small break to raise my family, and then went back to teaching after a little hiatus, and now I've been teaching in Providence for the past 7 years. English.
And this was at the middle school level in Providence? Or?
Part at the middle school and part at the high school level.
Okay. You've actually become somewhat of a celebrity as a result of your outspoken criticism about what happened in the last school year in Providence and seems likely to be continued into the next school year. Would you please recount what happened last September, and particularly the events that happened in January of last school year?
Okay, well, as you know, the Providence School District was taken over, and so we are all very excited about this new curriculum that was going to replace, or curriculum materials that was going to replace our older materials. Really, we had no idea what was in store, because what happened was an entire package came into, a whole curriculum package came into our school, and that meant that all our older materials were removed. So historical texts, literary texts, novels, all our projects, all of our units, anything that provided a comprehensive, objective lens or view of American history, or world history, multicultural history, for example. You know, any African American literature, for example, Harlem Renaissance, all of that was removed and replaced with a package. They call it a platform. I call it a curriculum package that included novels and hundreds of leaflet-style, pamphlet-style books that shared or included the same narrative over and over and over again.
What was the narrative?
Specifically, it looks from the outside, you know, like it was going to be a very interesting academic year, because we were given quarter 1, we're teaching the American Revolution, then the Civil War, and then westward expansion. So it sounds like a great, rigorous curriculum. However, the materials, the actual reading materials, were filled with that same narrative, where the primary focus was on the oppressor versus the oppressed in U.S. history. So it provided the children were not getting a comprehensive view, a complete view of all aspects, all characters, all historical figures, but primarily the focus was on that narrative, or sort of the slave narrative, which is an important narrative to teach. It's important as educators that we provide all the ugly and the positive parts of American history. But it seemed that the project focus and the books and literature all focused around that story of victim, what it was like to be a victim during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and westward expansion, and that alarmed me.
Did your fellow faculty members, your colleagues, did any of them express a concern about this new curriculum?
Yes, people did express concern. And most alarming was when the actual books were removed from our classroom. Now there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, so it's a huge task, as you can imagine. So, but during the course of the year, our teacher leaders came in and removed the books, our textbooks. So that was rather alarming. And you know, initially I don't think we really had a clear picture on what was happening, but I know that there was some pushback. There was a lot of concern that this new curriculum platform had books that were not, one, rigorous, but also presented this bizarre, you know, view of American history.
Did the faculty express any concerns to the administrators, and what was a reaction from the school administration?
There was some concern, and then we were provided with a survey to discuss, or to put on this survey our wish list of books that we would like to teach. But that to me is not good enough, because here we have an entire year where the projects and the books already were being rolled out to kids. At one point I asked one of the literary consultants, why aren't we teaching Anne Frank and the Holocaust? This is a staple, you know, traditionally taught in every single grade, in every public school. And I was told that it was not an appropriate subject, that the children could not relate to the Holocaust. And my response was, what do you mean that children can't relate to the Holocaust? Of course, as human beings, we all can relate to the subject of genocide and murder and discrimination and hate. So we should be teaching Anne Frank. We should be teaching the Holocaust. Instead, we were teaching the same narrative for every time period, the same thing.
So you said books were actually removed from the classroom and from the library. I heard you say in another venue that, as you just pointed out, Diary of Anne Frank, Romeo and Juliet, some of the other classics were literally taken off the shelves, put in a basket, and pushed out the door. Can you give us some of the titles that replaced these classics?
Well, each quarter, students typically would learn or read one novel. And around the novel, you have supplementary materials. So, for example, we would teach, we'd start the year teaching maybe multicultural literature. And the second semester might have been, you know, the Holocaust. And third semester, Shakespeare, and the final semester, multicultural literature, or perhaps poetry. All of that was replaced with this very sort of narrow set of projects and books. So authors like, you know, Shakespeare, every child can relate to the story of Romeo and Juliet. So why aren't we teaching this? This is a story that has universal themes about hate and discrimination and betrayal. Why wouldn't we be teaching Shakespeare to our children? And why wouldn't we teach James Baldwin, Go Tell It to the Mountain, or Martin Luther King, or Maya Angelou for that matter? When I asked these questions, I was told, well, these authors do not have significance. And yeah, exactly. My response was, well, says who? You know, who made this decision for this curriculum platform to completely overrun our previous curriculum, which included, you know, vetted textbooks, vetted literature from the canon, and, by the way, African-American literature as well.
Now, do I understand that the company, the publishing company that provided these materials, also, I think, used the term I call some sort of a reading coach that came in to try to convince the faculty that this is okay, or?
Well, we were provided with a monthly consultant who would provide us field questions that we had. If you can, you know, outwardly, so we were told we could ask questions, but really it was to guide us on the timeline. So we were given a timeline to follow. with projects, exactly. A very scripted teaching experience, so in teaching in subjects. And we all needed to follow this timeline. And once again, the timeline included project questions that revolved around the slave narrative. So the consultants, you know, if you questioned, you know, it always resulted in a little bit of tension, because you never really felt like, I never felt anyway, like I was free to truly ask any questions, because, you know, it was not met with sort of, to use one of the words that is thrown out there, one of those robust responses, you know? It was always met with a very politic kind of...
How dare you question me?
That's right. That is exactly right.
Now, I think most of our audience is aware that State Education Commissioner Angelica Infante Green was appointed by former Governor Gina Raimondo, now U.S. Commerce Secretary, in 2019. By authority of the state takeover of the Providence schools, she is effectively running the Providence school system. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. I heard you say in another venue that the Providence Teachers Union did some investigating into Commissioner Infante Green's background. Could you share with our audience what the union found out? Well,
I don't know specifically what the union found out. I do know that there was some question regarding certifications, valid certifications. So we were wondering about the superintendents who were given their positions and given superintendent qualifications without actually earning them at school. That was a question. Those superintendents are not here anymore, so we can't verify. But when we looked at, if you look at the RIDE portal, the Rhode Island Department of Education portal, and you check out anyone's certification, for example, if you put my name in that portal, you'll see all my valid certifications that I actually went to school for, and they're vetted and they're valid certifications. Mm-hmm. And we could not find any certifications related to Angelica Infante Green's credentials, which surprises me, because if you're going to be a commissioner of education, certainly you have to have some educational, you know, qualification that will make you qualified for that role. So when that was brought up, I believe at the Senate Ethics hearing, the response was, well, we're looking for quality candidates, not necessarily credentialed candidates. That's a paraphrasing.
In other words, it would appear that Commissioner Infante Green is not qualified to be a superintendent of schools anywhere in Rhode Island if the website or the portal is correct. If she doesn't have the credentials, and yet she's running the Providence school system, which is the largest in the state.
I don't understand. I mean, perhaps there are more different qualifications in her resume that, you know, we're unaware of. I don't know. I've never heard in all my years of being a teacher, and I've been teaching a very long time, that someone can actually be a commissioner of education and not have a valid certification as either a superintendent or you know, have that sort of background. I mean, if you're going to take over a failing school district, certainly you have to have some experience behind you and credentials behind you to prove that you know, you've acted as a commissioner of education somewhere, or you've taken coursework. So that's a question.
Now, our audience may not be aware that Governor Dan McKee removed Infante Green from contract negotiations with the Providence Teachers Union because she was regarded as a disruptive influence in reaching an agreement. A tentative agreement has now been reached through mediation, and I believe I heard that the union rank and file will vote on the contract on this coming Friday after this taping, which would be July 30th, I believe. Is the rank and file aware of any of the contract provisions that have been tentatively agreed to at this stage? You remember, obviously you're a member of the union.
I'm not specifically aware whether it's been shared with other faculty members at this point. I'm not sure, but that is always shared out in a very comprehensive way. So, but I haven't personally seen anything yet.
Do you know whether the Rhode Island Department of Education is pushing these books and curriculum on any of the other school districts in the state?
That's a great question. And yes, these books, this specific platform, it's called the American Reading Company platform. Although it's not called that, the same books and the same reading materials are available under different names, different company names. But oddly enough, what I found was interesting, it should come as no surprise that the consultants that work for the American Reading Company happen to also be the consultants that work for the other platforms, specifically the platform that was just purchased by Jamestown schools, for example.
Well, I'll be darned.
So, exactly, yeah. So it seems that there are 5 curriculums that are floated out there by the Rhode Island Department of Education. And it seems that they are all identical in nature. So they have different names, but really they're all, the same.
Okay.
They may be slightly different.
Now, the Providence Teachers Union is affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers, which is the second largest teachers union in the country. AFT President Randy Weingarten spoke out quite forcefully recently in support of teaching what is known as critical race theory in public schools. She went so far as to say that the union, the AFT, has set up a legal defense fund for any teacher who claims that she has been forbidden or pressured not to teach CRT. As an experienced educator and member of the union, do you have an opinion on such an announcement?
I'm absolutely flabbergasted. First of all, since when are politicians in the business of actually deciding curriculum and endorsing a curriculum that is filled with political ideology? Since when is political ideology being, pushed into schools? We should be doing the opposite. We should be providing our students with an objective view of history and literature and multicultural literature. We should not be pushing political ideology. And in fact, if I went into the classroom to share my political views with my students or pushed my political views in the classroom, I would be fired, and rightly so. So the fact that Randy Weingarten has actually done this is shocking to me. And quite frankly, she should be ashamed of herself, because she is selling the American people down the river, and she is also complicit in what I feel is child abuse, using our children as political pawns to gain, to fulfill some political agenda. And this is a political agenda. This is not about, if you want to get right down to it, it really is not about race. It is about power and control.
I should also mention that the largest teachers union, the National Education Association, has come out in support of teaching critical race theory. Do you or any of your colleagues in the school in which you teach, or the union members that you are familiar with, agree that systematic racism is a problem and CRT should be taught in the classroom?
No. There is no place for this cult-like CRT indoctrination in our classroom. We already had multicultural literature. We already have a very diverse historical narrative. We already have a very diverse country. There's no way around it. If you're teaching American history or American literature, you're already addressing race, diversity, inclusion. All of that has been removed. So effectively, the very thing that the Rhode Island Department of Education and the federal government would like to see in the classroom is no longer being represented, because critical race theory in itself, as it is embedded in the imagery, the plot, the setting, the characters, the narrative of all the material that we are teaching, is by nature a political ideology. And so it has zero, it should not be in our schools. It should be banned, it should be illegal. And we're going to try to find a way to make sure.
Is it true, and I've heard this, but I want to verify, is it true that when Providence teachers attend professional development sessions that they are segregated by race?
There are some, let me just explain that. We are not mandated to participate in this particular professional development, but we have to participate in some professional development in order to renew our certification. And as you look at all the offerings under our professional developments, there's very little available to teachers anymore regarding pedagogy. There's some pedagogy, classes that we can take to renew our certification, but very little. A lot of it has to do with slavery in America, race in America, and in particular, this particular workshop that was offered to teachers struck me as just awful. The fact that in this particular professional development, teachers were separated out into white affinity groups and black affinity groups, where we were given reading material. I think the title of the reading material for this particular professional development was called White Supremacy in the Classroom. I'm sorry, it's just incomprehensible.
I don't understand what it's supposed to accomplish if we're trying to be inclusive and diverse. If segregating teachers by race seems to do exactly the opposite.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
About 95% of Providence Public School students are black or other minority. Do you believe a white teacher can relate to these students and teach them effectively?
To say otherwise would be racist. And yes, I've seen it. As I said, the majority of my years were in a suburban school. So I'm new to the Providence district, in the past under 10 years. And I will say, I have seen the most compassionate, incredibly kind, diverse, caring educators and amazing teachers in Providence. I'm awed at how amazing they are, and I mean that. In my school alone, I've seen nothing but kindness and compassion. Race has never been an issue until this past year, when all of a sudden, I think it was in April, Angelica Infante Green made a sweeping statement that somehow, all of a sudden, Providence schools and all schools in Rhode Island needed to be revamped because there was no equity, or she, threw that term out that somehow, equity needed to be addressed, whatever that means, or this culture, or she wanted to introduce a culturally responsive curriculum, whatever that means, so, yeah.
Let's switch a little bit from Providence, but in South Kingstown, a mother with a child about to enter kindergarten in the fall questioned the school committee about a comment by an elementary school principal that teachers do not refer to students as boys and girls anymore. She, of course, was stonewalled by the committee, forcing her to file numerous requests under the Access to Public Records Act, to which the school administration threatened to take her to court. Have you seen any indication that Providence schools have been directed to engage in, for lack of a better term, gender-neutral conversation?
Not gender neutral. I haven't seen anything like that, but I did notice that there was a, more of a sort of emphasis this year on, kids questioning whether they were male or female. In fact, I'll share an example from my classroom. I had a couple of kids ask me, "Miss," said one student, "am I a boy or can I choose to be a girl?" And another girl asked me the very same question. And my first thought was, in all my years of teaching, I don't believe I've ever heard, a child ask me that question. And this child was concerned and worried about, his gender. He said to me, "I'm a boy, and I'm telling my mom that I'm a boy." This is what this young person said to me. Well, how do you even address or engage in a conversation? My immediate thought was, to sort of steer away from that conversation, because I don't think that as educators, it is our role or right to teach children or to talk to them about their gender choices, and certainly not in the middle school or at any age, but particularly at the middle school level, because children are exploring their identities. And if we are telling them, basically introducing all sorts of different sexual identities, then we're putting those identities into their minds, and that is not appropriate. Well, let's leave that up to the parents. It is not our job as educators to be having these discussions with children. These discussions, again, are very important to have, but they are not supposed to be had in our schools. They should not be had in our schools. And quite frankly, if it was in my child's school and an adult was talking to my child about that, I would call the police. And I encourage every parent to do so. If their child comes home and an adult is talking to their child about, I think the language in the proposed bill was pleasurable sexual relations, I recommend calling the police. None of that should be going on in our public schools.
The former South Kingstown School Committee Chairwoman Emily Comiskey accused the mother of, I'm going to quote, distracting from efforts to make our schools more equitable, inclusive, and empowering by eradicating any harmful practices or prejudices through equity and anti-racism teachings. She did not identify any harmful practices or prejudices or which schools, grades, or teachers were involved. Mrs. Kaminsky claimed that this taxpayer and mother was a pawn of a nationally organized racist group. Mrs. Bessinger, I'm going to ask you, are you involved knowingly or unknowingly in a national racist group that is trying to intimidate the Providence school system or Commissioner Infante Green?
No, but I will say that, I'll dignify that question only because that is the actual go-to response. If you oppose this authoritarian takeover of our schools, if you dare speak out against it, if you're a mother or a parent, they gang up on you. If you're a teacher in Providence, you get ganged up on. I know that firsthand, and so do many educators. If you're a parent in many school districts and you try to advocate for your child, as we saw in the case of Nicole Solis, you are actually intimidated, or they try to intimidate you. It didn't work with Nicole at all. And they, in fact, tried to sue her. And this is a tactic, right? Mm-hmm. Let's gang up, let's bully, let's try to intimidate these people. It's done regularly in third world countries. I wouldn't expect it here in the United States, and we won't stand for it.
The mother that we referred to, Nicole Solis, responded to her comment that equity is CRT code for discrimination based on race to achieve social outcomes. You think she's right? Is that what, when we talk about CRT, that's really what it is?
I think there's a lot of things happening with the CRT. I think it's a way to create racial division and hostility and to incite violence. This curriculum is not doing anything to help anyone in this country. So I think there are multiple agendas happening at once with the CRT. And I think that the African American people are, quite frankly, being used by a political group or a network, as they like to refer to themselves.
I think our audience is going to be somewhat surprised at some of these comments. We want to thank Mrs. Bessinger for coming on State of the State. We hope to continue this discussion in the future because it appears, as we have said, the effort is to inculcate this type of teaching and slant into all of the schools in the state of Rhode Island. And Akubin Owens, who lives in Newport and a monthly contributor to the Providence Journal, calls CRT a pernicious and reactionary theory that until recently was confined to academia. So the argument that CRT teaches history is incorrect. What is being taught is a theory, and I hope you, the audience, agree, and that you will indeed stay tuned for future editions of State of the State. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.